The message from my father arrived 3 minutes after my name hit the news. That timing mattered more than he knew. I was standing in what would become the lobby of the Hartford property when my phone buzzed. The space still smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, walls half finished, electrical conduits hanging like mechanical intestines from the ceiling. My architect was explaining why the original floor plan wouldn't work, something about load-bearing walls and historical preservation codes. But I'd stopped listening the moment I saw the notification. Family dinner tonight. We need to talk. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. 6 words. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the 4 years since he'd last contacted me. Just an assumption that I'd be available, that I'd come running, that whatever invisible thread connected us hadn't been severed by his absence at the one event that actually mattered. Pierce, you still with me? I looked up at Marcus, whose patience was admirable given that I was paying him roughly $300 an hour for this consultation. Sorry, continue. He did, gesturing at blueprints spread across a makeshift table of sawhorses and plywood. But my attention had fractured. I was back at the wedding venue, a renovated barn in Vermont that my wife had fallen in love with despite its astronomical rental fee. I could still see the rows of white chairs, the flower arrangements that cost more than my first car, the empty seat in the third row where Arthur Sterling was supposed to sit. No call, no text, no explanation that day or any day after. My wife, Jennifer, who tolerated my sarcasm and understood my silences better than I deserved, had squeezed my hand during the ceremony. Her grip said everything. I see it. I'm sorry. We'll get through this. And we had, in the way people get through things by not talking about them, by filing them away in mental cabinets labeled later or never. 4 years later felt like never arriving right on schedule. The permits alone will take 6 months, Marcus was saying. And that's if the Historical Society doesn't push back on the elevator shaft. I nodded, made appropriate sounds of acknowledgement, signed where he indicated. The Hartford property was the 5th in what my business partner liked to call our collection. I preferred portfolio, which sounded less like we were hoarding art and more like we understood basic finance. We'd started small, a 6-room boutique hotel in a Connecticut college town, the kind of place that catered to visiting professors and parents' weekend. Then Providence, then Burlington, now Hartford, with serious investors circling Boston and Portsmouth like well-dressed sharks. The valuation the magazine mentioned was real. $580 million wasn't revenue. It was what people smarter than me believed the whole operation was worth if we sold tomorrow. I wasn't selling tomorrow. I wasn't selling ever, probably. But the number looked impressive in print, which was the point of these articles. Free advertising wrapped in the appearance of journalism. My phone buzzed again. Confirmation? I stared at the word. Not, can you make it, or hope to see you. Just the demand for confirmation, as if my attendance was inevitable, as if 4 years of silence was a minor scheduling conflict we'd simply overlooked. The thing about resentment is that it doesn't announce itself with orchestra stings or dramatic revelations. It accumulates quietly, like interest on a loan you didn't know you'd taken out. I hadn't realized how much I'd stored up until that moment, standing in a half-finished hotel lobby, watching my father's name glow on a screen like a summons from someone who believed they still had authority over me. You good? Marcus asked, rolling up the blueprints. Perfect, I said, which was the kind of lie that everyone accepts because the truth would take too long to explain. I left the Hartford site and drove back to the office, a converted warehouse space in New Haven that we'd renovated 2 years ago. My business partner, Claire, was in the conference room with our CFO, both of them surrounded by spreadsheets and coffee cups in various stages of abandonment. She looked up when I walked in, read something in my expression, and dismissed the CFO with a glance. What happened? Nothing, I said, then corrected myself. My father wants to have dinner. Claire had been there since the beginning, back when the beginning meant maxing out credit cards and sleeping on air mattresses in properties we couldn't afford to furnish. She knew about the wedding, about the empty chair, about the particular quality of silence that followed unanswered questions. When was the last time you talked to him? The wedding, before it, technically. He said he'd be there. And now? Now the magazine comes out, the valuation goes public, and apparently we need to talk. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression she used when analyzing acquisition targets, calculating, skeptical, already running scenarios. You going? Haven't decided. That was a lie. I'd already decided. The question was whether I'd admit it to myself before I showed up at whatever restaurant he'd chosen, whatever neutral territory he'd deemed appropriate for his reappearance in my life. The rest of the day passed in meetings and phone calls and the ordinary machinery of running a business that was expanding faster than I'd planned. I'd wanted growth, but controlled growth, the kind where you understood every moving part. Instead, we were in that dangerous territory between startup and established, where investors had opinions and the media paid attention, and every decision felt like it was being made on a stage I hadn't auditioned for. By 6 o'clock, I'd convinced myself I wasn't going to the dinner. By 6:30, I was getting in my car. By 7, I was parking outside a restaurant in West Hartford that specialized in the kind of upscale Italian food that businessmen use to impress clients. The choice felt calculated, expensive enough to show he'd made an effort, public enough to prevent a scene. I sat in the car for 5 minutes, watching the entrance. Couples walked in holding hands. Groups of friends laughed at jokes I couldn't hear. Everyone looked like they belonged in their lives, like their family dinners were occasions for celebration rather than negotiation. My phone buzzed. "Jennifer, how's Hartford?" "Complicated," I typed back. "Tell you later." She sent back a heart emoji, which was her way of saying she trusted me to handle whatever I was handling. 4 years of marriage had taught us both that some conversations happened better in person, that text messages were for logistics and reassurance, not actual communication. I got out of the car. The November air had that particular bite that meant winter was coming early, the kind of cold that made you walk faster without realizing it. The restaurant's interior was warm, dimly lit, full of the ambient noise of people enjoying expensive meals they could afford. Arthur Sterling was already seated, middle of the room, facing the door. He'd aged since the wedding, more gray, deeper lines around his eyes, but still recognizable. Still wearing the expression I remembered from childhood, that look of mild disappointment as if the world was constantly failing to meet his very reasonable expectations. He stood when he saw me. Not quite a smile, not quite neutral. Somewhere in between, the kind of expression that said, "Let's see how this goes." "Pierce." He extended his hand. I shook it because refusing would have been theater, and I'd learned a long time ago that real power was quiet. "Arthur." We sat. A waiter appeared, recited specials I didn't listen to, disappeared when we both ordered wine we didn't need. The silence between us stretched like old elastic, worn but not quite broken. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. "You were very insistent." He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "I know it's been a while. 4 years, 3 months, approximately 12 days. You've been counting." "No, I just remember when people don't show up to my wedding." The words landed between us like objects dropped from a height, not violent, but final. He picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking, repeated the gesture like a nervous tic he was trying to suppress. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't, actually. You owed me attendance. That deadline passed." I watched him process the word, saw the calculation in his eyes. How much to apologize, how much to explain, how much to simply move past. He'd always been good at math, at finding the most efficient path between 2 points. Emotion was inefficient. Emotion was a variable you eliminated when possible. "I made a mistake," he said carefully. "Which part? Missing the ceremony or waiting 4 years to mention it?" "Both, probably." The waiter returned with wine. We performed the ritual of tasting and approving, both of us buying time, both of us aware that the real conversation hadn't started yet. Arthur raised his glass in a gesture that might have been a toast if either of us had anything to celebrate. "I saw the article," he said. "Very impressive." And there it was. The reason for the dinner? For the timing, for the sudden restoration of communication. Not regret, not paternal pride, not even curiosity about the intervening years. Just recognition that I'd become someone worth talking to, that the son he'd dismissed had somehow become successful enough to warrant his attention. "Which part impressed you?" I asked. "The valuation, or the fact that I did it without your support?" "That's not fair." Neither was the empty chair. He set down his glass with more force than necessary. A few people at nearby tables glanced over, then away. Public spaces were designed for the illusion of privacy, the pretense that other people's drama wasn't entertainment. "I'm trying to apologize," he said. "No, you're trying to reestablish contact. Those aren't the same thing." The food arrived. Some pasta dish I'd ordered without thinking, some protein he'd requested with detailed preparation instructions. We ate in silence, which felt more honest than anything we'd said so far. This was the truth of us. 2 people who shared genetic material and a last name, sitting across from each other like strangers in a waiting room, marking time until we could leave. "I'd like to be part of your life again," he said eventually. "Why?" "Because you're my son." I was your son 4 years ago. I was your son when I told you about the business idea, and you said hospitality was a dying industry. I was your son when I needed a co-signer for the first property loan, and you said it was too risky. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. He didn't have an answer for that. The truth was too obvious, too documented in years of dismissal and doubt. He'd been an accountant his entire career, someone who measured risk in spreadsheets and found comfort in predictable outcomes. My business was neither spreadsheet-friendly nor predictable. It was intuition and timing and a willingness to bet on spaces other people had written off. The fact that I'd been right didn't erase his wrongness. It just made the empty chair that much more conspicuous. What do you want? I asked, because directness was the only tool left. To reconnect, to be there for you now. Now that there's something worth being there for. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. That's not how I meant it. But it's how it is. The check arrived. I reached for it automatically, but he was faster, pulling out a credit card with the kind of performative generosity that said, "See, I'm paying attention now." I let him have it. Small victories weren't worth fighting for. Outside, the November air felt colder than before, or maybe I was just more aware of it. We stood on the sidewalk, two men who looked related but weren't. Not in any way that mattered. Think about it, Arthur said. We can start over. We can't, I said. But we can start something new. I didn't explain what that meant. He'd figure it out eventually, or he wouldn't. Either way, the evening had confirmed what I'd suspected the moment his message arrived. His timing wasn't coincidence. It was calculation. And I'd spent 4 years learning how to calculate right back. I drove home thinking about leather folders and itemized lists, about the difference between forgiveness and boundaries, about what it meant to be successful enough that people who'd ignored you suddenly wanted your attention. The message was waiting when I got home. Good seeing you. Let's do this again soon. I didn't respond. Some questions answered themselves if you waited long enough. The magazine hit newsstands on a Thursday, which meant by Friday morning my phone had become a liability. I'd silenced it after the 7th call from a cousin I hadn't spoken to since high school, the one who'd made it very clear at graduation that my college choice was brave, in the way people use that word when they mean stupid. Jennifer found me in the kitchen, staring at the phone like it was evidence in a crime I hadn't committed yet. How many? She asked. 17 missed calls, 23 texts, 6 emails from people I'm not sure actually exist. She poured coffee, slid a cup across the counter. Your uncle? Both of them, plus the cousin in Michigan who sells insurance, plus someone claiming to be my father's brother, which is interesting because my father's brother has been out of the country for 15 years. What do they want? Investment opportunities, advice, reconnection. I picked up the phone, scrolled through the messages. One of them wants me to speak at their kid's career day. Jennifer laughed, which was the appropriate response. She'd been through this before, in smaller doses, the Providence opening, the Burlington announcement. But this felt different. The magazine was national. The photograph they'd used made me look more competent than I felt most days. The headline called me a hospitality disruptor, which sounded like something you'd need antibiotics for. Your father? She asked carefully. 3 messages yesterday, 2 this morning. She didn't say anything, just waited. 4 years of marriage had taught her that silence was sometimes the best question. He wants to meet again. Says he has some ideas about expansion. Ideas. His word, not mine. I'd thought about the dinner constantly since it happened, replaying conversations, analyzing his expressions, trying to determine if there was any genuine remorse beneath the performance. The conclusion I'd reached was unsatisfying. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but it didn't matter because the timing told the real story. He'd waited until success was undeniable, until ignoring me became more expensive than acknowledging me. My phone buzzed again. Claire? Conference room. 10 minutes. Bring coffee. The office was chaos when I arrived, but controlled chaos, the kind that came from having too much good news instead of too much bad. Our marketing director had printed and framed the magazine cover. It hung in the conference room like a diploma, or proof that we'd graduated from interesting startup to legitimate business. Claire was already there, laptop open, surrounded by what appeared to be every chart and graph our CFO had ever generated. She looked up when I walked in, expression somewhere between excitement and concern. Boston called, she said. Which Boston? The investors, the ones we met with in September. I sat down, set my coffee on the table with deliberate care. And? They want to move forward. Full partnership. $50 million for expansion, with options for more if we hit targets. This should have been good news. This was good news. $50 million was the kind of money that turned theoretical plans into actual construction, that let us stop being careful and start being ambitious. But Claire's expression suggested complications. What's the catch? No catch. Standard terms, board seat, quarterly reviews, the usual oversight structure. Then why do you look like someone just handed you a subpoena? She closed the laptop, leaned back. Because 3 other investment groups called this morning, because my phone hasn't stopped since the magazine dropped, because we're about to have options, and options mean decisions, and decisions mean we can't just wing it anymore. I understood what she wasn't saying. We were entering territory where mistakes became expensive, where intuition needed to be supplemented by strategy, where the business we'd built through hustle and luck now required actual expertise. We need lawyers, I said. Already called them. Meeting next week. Financial advisors. Scheduled for Wednesday. Someone to handle the random cousins claiming they always believed in us? She smiled. That's what caller ID is for. We spent the next 3 hours going through proposals, analyzing terms, building spreadsheets that tried to predict futures we couldn't actually predict. By noon, my head hurt and my coffee had gone cold, and I'd signed enough documents to feel like I'd aged a decade. My phone buzzed. Arthur again? Lunch tomorrow. I'd like to discuss some opportunities. I showed Claire the message. She read it, handed the phone back like it might be contagious. You going? Haven't decided. That means yes. She was right, which was annoying. I'd already decided the moment I saw the message, already calculated the angles, already determined that refusing would give him power by making me seem afraid of engagement. Better to meet, to listen, to let him reveal exactly what kind of opportunity he thought we had. The afternoon disappeared into more meetings, more calls, more people who suddenly remembered we'd been friends or classmates or neighbors. One of them, a guy I vaguely remembered from college, actually used the phrase, "always knew you'd make it," which was impressive given that his last words to me had been something about hospitality being a service industry for people who couldn't do real work. Jennifer texted around 5. Dinner at home? Just us? Perfect, I sent back, then added, need normal. She understood. Normal meant no business talk, no investor pitches, no relatives emerging from decades of silence with convenient memories of closeness. Normal meant pasta and wine and sitting on the couch watching television we'd forget by morning. But normal was harder to achieve than I'd anticipated. Even at home, my phone kept lighting up with notifications, each one a small reminder that privacy was now a luxury I'd have to actively defend. I finally turned it off completely, which felt like hiding, but also like survival. You okay? Jennifer asked during dinner. Adjusting. To what? Being the person people suddenly care about. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand. I cared about you when you were failing. I wasn't failing. You were failing magnificently. That first property almost bankrupted us. She was right. The College Town Hotel had been a disaster for the first 18 months. Wrong pricing, wrong marketing, wrong everything. We'd fixed it through trial and error and the kind of desperation that made you creative, but there had been a month where we'd seriously discussed whether cutting our losses was smarter than continuing. I miss that, I said. Being broke? Being invisible? She laughed, but not unkindly. You were never invisible to me. That night, I lay awake thinking about visibility and value, about how success changed the way people saw you without changing who you actually were. The person lying in bed was the same person who'd maxed out credit cards and slept on air mattresses. But to everyone else, to the investors, the magazine, the cousins emerging from silence, I'd become someone new, someone worth their attention. Arthur's message was still there when I turned my phone back on in the morning. I texted back, noon, Maritime Grill. You're buying. His response was immediate. See you there. The Maritime Grill was one of those waterfront places that catered to business lunches and anniversary dinners, expensive enough to signal seriousness, but not so expensive it felt like performance. I arrived early, got a table by the window, watched boats move through the harbor like they had destinations that mattered. Arthur showed up exactly on time, which had always been his way. Punctual, prepared, presenting himself as someone who respected other people's schedules even when he didn't respect much else about them. He'd dressed carefully, button-down shirt, slacks, the kind of outfit that said, retired but not irrelevant. Thanks for meeting, he said, sitting down. You were persistent. I wanted to talk about the magazine piece. Very impressive coverage. I waited. The waiter appeared, took drink orders, left us with menus we weren't reading. Arthur was building to something, and I'd learned that rushing him only made conversations last longer. I've been thinking, he said finally, about your expansion plans. Have you? The article mentioned Boston and Portsmouth. Those are solid markets, but have you considered secondary cities? Places where real estate is cheaper, where you could scale faster? I sipped my water, watching him. This was the opportunity he'd referenced, the reason for his persistence. Not reconnection, not apology, but a chance to be useful, to insert himself into the narrative of my success as something other than an absence. We have a strategy, I said. I'm sure you do. But I spent 30 years analyzing markets, understanding risk, evaluating opportunities. I could help. Help how? Advisory role, just guidance. I wouldn't need salary or equity, just access. He stopped, recalibrated. I was going to say involvement. Same thing. The food arrived. Fish for him, steak for me, both of us eating because not eating would have been too obvious. He was trying to find an angle, a way into the structure I'd built without his support, and I was watching him try with the kind of detached curiosity you'd give a chess opponent whose strategy you'd already anticipated. I know I wasn't there before, he said carefully. I know I made mistakes, but I'm here now, and I want to contribute. To what? To your success? My success is already happening. It could happen faster, smarter. I have connections, experience, perspective you might find valuable. I set down my fork, looked at him directly. Let me make sure I understand. You want to be involved in my business, the same business you said was too risky in an industry you called unsuitable, because now it's worth $580 million. That's not fair? It's completely fair. It's just not flattering. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, shifting in his chair like the cushions had become hostile. Around us, other diners conducted their own negotiations, their own performances of interest and connection, everyone pretending that lunch was about food instead of leverage. I'm trying to repair our relationship, he said, by making yourself useful. Is that so wrong? It's practical. I can appreciate practical. He took this as encouragement, which was a mistake. So you'll consider it? I'll consider what you're actually asking for versus what you're claiming to offer. Meaning you want proximity to success. You want to tell people you're involved, that your son's business is something you're part of. You want the association without having done the work. I'm offering to do the work now. The work is done. What's left is growth, which I don't need your help with. The table had gone quiet, not silent. Background noise continued, other conversations, the ambient sound of silverware and glassware. But between us, the silence was absolute. He'd played his hand and I'd called it, and now we were just two people sitting across from each other with nothing left to negotiate. I see, he said finally. Do you? You're angry. I'm realistic. There's a difference. He reached for his wallet, but I was faster, dropping my credit card on the check before he could perform generosity again. Small gestures sometimes carried more weight than grand ones. This isn't over, he said as we stood to leave. It's been over for 4 years. You just didn't notice. Outside, the November wind had picked up, turning the harbor choppy, making the boats look less purposeful and more desperate. Arthur stood on the sidewalk like he was waiting for something. A different ending, maybe, or a version of this conversation where I'd been more receptive to his sudden interest. I'll be in touch, he said. I'm sure you will. I walked to my car feeling nothing in particular, which was its own kind of message. No anger, no satisfaction, just the calm recognition that some relationships ended not with explosions, but with quiet acknowledgement that they'd never really existed in the first place. My phone buzzed as I started the engine. Claire, how'd it go? Exactly as expected, I typed back. That good? That predictable? I drove back to the office thinking about access and value, about the difference between being present and being useful, about how some people calculated relationships like investments, waiting to see returns before committing resources. The leather folder was in my desk drawer, empty but ready. I'd purchased it the day after the first dinner, anticipation building like interest on a loan I knew would eventually come due. Inside, I'd begun compiling documents. Simple things, really, nothing dramatic or theatrical. Just facts, organized chronologically, telling a story without embellishment. Some stories didn't need exaggeration, they just needed documentation. The dinner invitation arrived via email this time, formal enough to suggest Arthur had put thought into the presentation. Subject line, family gathering. Body text, brief, cordial, requesting my presence at Marcello's on Saturday evening. He'd copied 3 other people on the message, relatives I recognized by name but hadn't seen in years. Jennifer read it over my shoulder while I made coffee. He's bringing witnesses, she said. Looks that way. You going? Probably. She didn't ask why, which meant she already understood. Refusing would look like avoidance, like his persistence had rattled me enough to retreat. Better to show up, to demonstrate that his sudden interest in family gatherings didn't carry the weight he seemed to think it did. I replied with a single word. Confirmed. The week passed in the usual chaos of expansion. Conference calls with architects, negotiations with contractors, meetings with investors who all seemed to have opinions about which markets we should target next. Claire had started building spreadsheets that projected 5 years out, which felt simultaneously optimistic and presumptuous. 5 years ago, I'd been trying to convince a bank that a 6-room hotel in a college town was worth the risk. Friday afternoon, my uncle called. Robert Sterling, Arthur's younger brother, the one who'd always been polite at family gatherings without ever being warm. We'd exchanged maybe 50 words total over the years, most of them about weather or traffic. "Pierce, glad I caught you," he said, voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to ask for something. "Looking forward to tomorrow." "Likewise. Your father mentioned you might be bringing some materials to discuss? Business plans or projections?" I paused, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. "Did he?" "He said you'd been working on some documentation. Thought it might be helpful for the family to understand the growth trajectory, opportunities for involvement." The phrasing was too careful, too rehearsed. Arthur had been setting expectations, building a narrative where I'd show up prepared to pitch, to seek approval or input or whatever validation he'd decided I needed. "I'll bring materials," I said. They might not be exactly what he's expecting. "Wonderful. See you tomorrow." I hung up and pulled the leather folder from my desk drawer. It had acquired more contents over the past week. Not many, just enough to tell the story I wanted to tell. Wedding venue contract with Arthur's name on the guest list. Text messages from 4 years ago, screenshotted and printed. The loan application he'd declined to co-sign. His signature on the refusal form. A transcript of a voicemail he'd left 6 years ago, when I'd first mentioned the hospitality idea. His voice dripping with the kind of condescension that masqueraded as concern. Nothing dramatic, nothing fabricated, just documentation. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear, the kind of November night that made you grateful for heated car seats and restaurants with effective HVAC systems. Marcello's was upscale Italian, the kind of place where they ground pepper tableside and wine lists required reading glasses. Arthur had chosen well, expensive enough to show effort, public enough to enforce civility. He was already there when I arrived, seated at a round table with Robert and 2 other relatives I vaguely recognized. Arthur's sister Margaret, I thought, and her husband whose name I'd never successfully retained. They looked up when I approached, expressions carefully arranged into welcome. "Pierce," Arthur stood, extending his hand like we were colleagues meeting for the first time. "Thanks for coming." I shook hands around the table, exchanged pleasantries that meant nothing, sat in the chair they'd left open like it was assigned seating at a wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. "We were just discussing the magazine article," Margaret said. Her smile was bright, practiced, the kind that probably worked well at charity functions. "Very impressive. We're all so proud." "Are you?" "Of course. Family success is something to celebrate." I nodded, said nothing. The waiter appeared with menus and water glasses, recited specials that everyone pretended to consider. We ordered. Too much food, probably. But that was the performance. The demonstration that this was a celebration rather than an interrogation. "Your father tells us you're considering expansion into multiple new markets," Robert said once the waiter had left. "Boston, Portsmouth, maybe Providence again?" "We're evaluating options." "Must be exciting, all those opportunities." "It's methodical, less exciting than it sounds." Arthur leaned forward slightly, the gesture of someone about to share important information. "I've been telling everyone about your growth trajectory. 5 properties in 4 years, valuation north of $500 million. Remarkable for someone who started with essentially nothing." The phrasing was careful, praising the achievement while emphasizing the starting point, the implicit suggestion that I'd come from disadvantage that family support could have prevented. Margaret and Robert nodded along, performing agreement with whatever narrative Arthur had constructed. "Not nothing," I said. I had a credit card and a belief that people would pay for hotels that didn't look like corporate templates. "Still," Margaret said, "it must have been difficult, starting without family backing." It was clarifying. Arthur's expression flickered. Not quite a frown, not quite confusion. "How so?" It eliminated ambiguity about who was actually committed to the outcome. The appetizers arrived, buying everyone a moment to process that statement. Calamari, bruschetta, some kind of cured meat arrangement that looked more decorative than edible. We ate in the particular silence that comes from people unsure whether to address what's just been said or pretend it wasn't. Robert tried first. "Well, you've certainly proved yourself. I think what your father is hoping is that we can all be involved going forward. Family should support family, even if the timing wasn't ideal before. Timing, I repeated. Interesting word choice. Pierce, Arthur started, but I raised a hand. No, I appreciate the honesty. Timing wasn't ideal. I needed support when I was unproven, risky, likely to fail. Now that failure is off the table, timing has improved considerably. Margaret's smile had frozen into something that might crack if she moved too quickly. Her husband, David, I remembered suddenly, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Robert studied his appetizer with intense focus. Arthur cleared his throat. I understand you're frustrated about the past, but we're here to talk about the future. Are we? Because the invitation said family gathering, not business meeting. Can't it be both? It could be, but let's be clear about which one matters to you. The table had gone quiet again. Around us, other diners enjoyed their meals, their own family gatherings, presumably free of the tension currently occupying ours. A child laughed somewhere. Glassware clinked. Normal sounds from normal people having normal evenings. I brought something, I said, reaching down for the leather folder I'd set beside my chair, since we're discussing the future and my business trajectory. Arthur's expression shifted. Anticipation, maybe, or vindication that I'd brought what he'd apparently promised I would. Robert leaned forward slightly. Margaret's smile regained some authenticity, as if we were finally getting to the point of the evening. I set the folder on the table, but didn't open it yet. I've spent the last week compiling information, I said. Documentation of our relationship, key moments, decisions made and not made. I thought it might be useful for everyone to have context. Context for what? Margaret asked. For understanding why I'm declining your offers of involvement. Arthur's face hardened. Pierce, that's not necessary. It's completely necessary. I opened the folder, pulled out the first document. Wedding venue contract. Guest list. One Arthur Sterling, marked confirmed, with a note that he'd requested the aisle seat for better photographs. I slid it across the table. Margaret picked it up, scanned it, set it down like it might be evidence in a trial, which in a way it was. He didn't show, I continued. No call, no message, no explanation, just an empty chair and a lot of questions I stopped asking after it became clear they wouldn't be answered. I explained that, Arthur said, voice tight. I explained at our first dinner. It was a mistake. You said it was a mistake. You didn't explain it. I pulled out another document. Loan application for the first property. 3 banks turned me down before I found one that would take the risk. I asked you to co-sign. You declined via certified letter. I slid the letter across. Your signature. Your statement that you couldn't, in good conscience, support a venture with such uncertain prospects. Robert picked up this document, read it slowly. His expression suggested he hadn't known about the loan request, which meant Arthur's version of history had been selectively edited. Business decisions, Arthur said. Risk assessment. Surely you understand that now. I understand that completely. I also understand that your risk assessment changed the moment the valuation became public. Another document. Voicemail transcript from 6 years ago. You called the hospitality industry saturated and told me I was chasing trends instead of building career stability. Direct quote. Margaret was no longer smiling. Her husband had stopped pretending to eat. Robert looked between me and Arthur like he was watching a chess game where the outcome had just become inevitable. The point, I said, gathering the documents back into the folder, is not to shame anyone or rehash old grievances. The point is to establish a clear record of engagement, or lack thereof. You're being vindictive, Arthur said. I'm being thorough. There's a difference. The entrees arrived, which should have been good timing, but instead felt like an interruption. The waiter sensed something wrong, set down plates quickly, retreated without offering to grind pepper or refill wine. Smart man. What do you want? Arthur asked quietly. I want you to understand something very clearly. I closed the folder, set it aside. You weren't there when it mattered. You weren't there when support would have meant something, when belief would have changed outcomes, when showing up would have been the only thing I needed. You were absent, deliberately, consistently absent. And now? Now you want proximity to something you didn't build. You want association with success you didn't support. You want to tell people you're involved, that you're part of this, that family matters. Family does matter. Then why didn't it matter 4 years ago, or 6 years ago, or any time before the magazine came out? He had no answer for that. Robert had stopped eating. Margaret was staring at her plate like it contained answers to questions she hadn't known to ask. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became the point. I don't need your involvement, I said. I don't need your advice or connections or strategic guidance. I built this without you. It works without you. It will continue to work without you. So this whole dinner was a performance? Arthur's voice had edges now, the careful control slipping. You came here to humiliate me in front of family? I came here because you invited me. I brought documentation because you apparently promised everyone I'd discuss business opportunities. I'm simply clarifying what kind of opportunities exist. Which are? None? The word landed like something dropped from a height. Final. Unambiguous. The kind of statement that didn't require elaboration or softening or diplomatic cushioning. Margaret stood abruptly. I think we should go, David. Her husband rose immediately, grateful for the exit. They mumbled something about prior commitments, about how lovely it had been to see me, about staying in touch. Standard departure language that everyone understood was performance. They were gone within minutes, leaving just the three of us. Arthur, Robert, and me. Was this necessary? Robert asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. It was honest, I said, which felt necessary. He nodded slowly, stood, placed his napkin on the table with deliberate care. For what it's worth, I think you're right to be angry. I think the timing looks exactly like it looks. He glanced at Arthur. I'll talk to you later. Then he was gone too, leaving just Arthur and me at a table set for 5, surrounded by partially eaten food and the wreckage of whatever reunion he'd been planning. You've made your point, he said. Have I? What more do you want? I pulled one more document from the folder, placed it in front of him. He picked it up, scanned it, set it down like it had burned his fingers. A no-contact boundary, he said slowly. You're formally requesting I cease all communication. I'm formally establishing a boundary. I don't want calls, emails, surprise dinners, or ambushes disguised as family gatherings. I don't want your input, your advice, or your sudden interest in my life. I'm your father. Biologically, nothing else. His face had gone pale, but whether from anger or shock or something else, I couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. He'd pushed for this meeting, created this circumstance, invited witnesses to whatever reconciliation he'd imagined. The outcome was his responsibility. If you violate this, I said, tapping the document, I'll enforce it legally. Harassment statutes are very clear. You'd sue your own father? I'd protect my boundaries. The relationship is incidental. I stood, dropped cash on the table for my portion of the meal I hadn't finished. The folder stayed with me, evidence secured, the story documented. Arthur sat there, staring at the no-contact order like it was written in a language he didn't speak. This isn't over, he said. It's been over. You're just catching up. I walked out into the November cold, breath visible, hands steady. My car was where I'd left it, unremarkable and exactly where it should be. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, processing nothing in particular, feeling the calm that comes from finishing something difficult but necessary. My phone buzzed. Jennifer, how was dinner? Clarifying, I typed back. Coming home? On my way. I drove through streets that looked like every other city street, past restaurants and shops and people living their lives without drama or documentation or leather folders full of evidence. Normal people, normal evening. Nothing remarkable about any of it. The folder sat on the passenger seat, lighter now, but not empty. There was one more document inside, one more piece of the story that hadn't been necessary tonight but would be soon. Some boundaries required documentation, others required enforcement. I was prepared for both. The response came faster than I'd anticipated. 3 days after the dinner, a letter arrived at my office. Not email, actual paper in an envelope, delivered by courier. Arthur's lawyer, apparently, believed in the formality of physical correspondence. Claire brought it to my desk, eyebrow raised. Legal letterhead. Your father? His representation. Should I be worried? Only if you think strongly worded objections constitute actual threats. She left me to read it, closing the door behind her with the kind of discretion that made her an excellent business partner. The letter was exactly what I'd expected. Professional outrage, citations of family obligation, suggestions that my no-contact boundary was both unreasonable and unenforceable. The lawyer had tried to sound intimidating while carefully avoiding anything that might actually constitute a threat. I filed it in the leather folder and went back to work. The real retaliation started 2 weeks later, subtle at first. A member of the local Chamber of Commerce mentioned at a networking event that he'd heard concerning things about my business practices. Nothing specific, just vague implications delivered with the kind of concern that was really curiosity. Then a vendor we'd used for 3 years suddenly wanted new contract terms, explaining that reputation management required higher insurance requirements from partners. Jennifer noticed before I did. Someone's talking, she said one evening over dinner. Someone's spreading something. Arthur, you think? I think he's the kind of person who believes influence is a substitute for actual power. She set down her fork, studied me with the expression she used when deciding whether to push or let something develop. What are you going to do? Nothing dramatic. That's not reassuring. It's honest. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already made calls, quiet inquiries to people who understood how reputation worked in business circles. The picture that emerged was predictable. Arthur had been carefully suggesting that my success was built on shaky foundations, that expansion was reckless, that family concerns about stability were being ignored, nothing actionable, nothing he could be directly confronted about, just innuendo delivered with the concern of a worried father. It was smarter than I'd given him credit for, and more irritating. The Chamber of Commerce thing resolved itself when the director called to apologize. Someone had apparently clarified that the concerning things were actually just family drama, not business issues. The vendor situation took longer, required a meeting with their legal team, but ultimately amounted to nothing more than inconvenience. But the pattern was clear. Arthur was testing boundaries, seeing what kind of social leverage he could generate, whether he could create enough discomfort to force engagement. He'd moved from direct contact to indirect pressure, which suggested either strategy or desperation, possibly both. I waited 3 weeks before responding. Patience, I'd learned, was its own form of message. The second meeting happened at Marcello's again, which felt like Arthur's attempt at symbolic reclamation, returning to the scene of his defeat, trying to rewrite the outcome. I'd agreed to meet because refusing would have looked like retreat, and because I had my own agenda for the conversation. He was already seated when I arrived, same table as before, though this time it was just the two of us. No witnesses, no family buffer, no performance of reunion. Just two people who shared a last name and very little else. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "You were insistent, again." I wanted to apologize for how the last dinner ended. "Which part? The part where I documented your absence, or the part where I established boundaries you've been systematically ignoring?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I may have been talking to people, trying to understand your business better." Talking to people, interesting euphemism. I wanted perspective. "You wanted leverage." The waiter appeared, took drink orders, retreated. The restaurant was less crowded this time, afternoon instead of evening, the lighting harsher and less forgiving. Arthur looked older in daylight, or maybe I was just paying more attention to details I'd missed before. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said carefully. "Both times. I understand you're angry about the past, and you have every right to be, but this escalation isn't helping anyone." "Escalation? You mean the no-contact boundary?" "I mean the complete severance of family relationship over mistakes that happened years ago." I leaned back, studying him. The performance was more refined this time, less desperate, more calculated. He'd had time to prepare, to anticipate objections, to build whatever argument he thought would work. The problem was that I'd had the same time, and I'd used it to prepare something he wasn't expecting. "Let me show you something," I said, pulling papers from the messenger bag I'd brought. Not the leather folder this time. That had served its purpose. These were different documents, spread across the table in neat arrangement. "What is this?" Arthur asked. "Financial analysis. Your retirement portfolio, your property holdings, your income streams." I tapped the first page. "You retired at 55, which was early but not remarkable. Decent pension, some investment income, the house paid off, comfortable but not extravagant." His expression had gone carefully neutral. "How did you—" "Public records mostly. Some educated guessing. The rest from the vendor you tried to pressure. Turns out their CEO is an old friend from college. He was very helpful when I explained the situation." "You investigated me." "I documented our relationship. Since you seemed interested in my business practices, I thought you might appreciate transparency." He picked up the papers, scanned them with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades analyzing financial documents. His hands were steady, but his jaw had tightened in a way that suggested I'd hit closer to truth than he wanted to acknowledge. "Your investments are conservative," I continued. "Very safe, very slow growth. Nothing wrong with that for someone in their 60s. But it also means you're not in a position to be advising rapid business expansion, because your experience is risk aversion, not calculated risk. Experience is experience. Experience is context dependent. Your context was making sure retirement funds stayed safe. Mine is building something from nothing. Those aren't the same skill set." The drinks arrived. Neither of us touched them. Arthur set the papers down, aligned them with obsessive precision, buying time to formulate whatever response he thought would work. "What's your point?" he asked finally. My point is that you want access to my business, not because you have something to offer, but because you need the association. Your identity for 30 years was being an accountant. Your identity now is being retired. But if you're the father of Pierce Sterling, hotel entrepreneur, valuation over $500 million, that's a better story. That's not... It's exactly that. You want proximity to relevance? I'm just not willing to provide it. His face had flushed, color rising in the particular way that suggested anger mixing with embarrassment. You're being cruel. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. I'm your father. You keep saying that like it's an argument instead of a biological fact. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against floor loud enough that nearby tables glanced over. This conversation is over. No, it isn't. Sit down. Something in my tone made him pause. Not volume. I'd kept my voice level, conversational, but certainty. The absolute confidence that I had more to say, and he was going to hear it whether he wanted to or not. He sat, slowly, reluctantly, but he sat. I pulled one more document from the bag, placed it in front of him. He looked at it like it might be dangerous, which showed more self-awareness than I'd credited him with. What is this? Itemized account. Every dollar you promised and didn't deliver. Wedding costs you said you'd contribute to $15,000. The cosign you refused to provide cost me an extra 3 points on the loan rate, which over 5 years equals roughly $42,000 in additional interest. The office space you said you'd help secure, but backed out of. That delay cost approximately $60,000 in lost revenue opportunity. He was scanning the document, eyes moving faster as he processed what I'd compiled. The list continued, small promises, verbal agreements, casual statements of support that had evaporated when I'd actually needed them. $173,000, I said. That's the documented value of support you promised and withdrew. That's not counting emotional costs or reputational damage or any of the intangible effects of having a father who disappeared when it mattered. You can't put a price on family. You already did. The price was 0 when you thought I'd fail and $173,000 now that success is visible. This is absurd. You're not actually suggesting I owe you money. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating fact. You owe me $173,000 in documented support you promised and failed to deliver. He laughed, short and bitter. You can't enforce this. This isn't a contract. Some of it is. The wedding contribution was written agreement. The office space had an email chain. The rest is verbal contract, which is still binding in Connecticut for certain amounts and circumstances. You'd sue me. I'd consider it. Or you could acknowledge what you actually owe and stop pretending this is about family connection rather than social positioning. The restaurant had gone quieter around us, or maybe I was just more aware of the silence at our table. Arthur was staring at the itemized list like it was evidence at his own trial, which in a way it was. What do you want? He asked finally, voice flat. I want you to understand boundaries. I want you to stop calling vendors, spreading concerns, trying to create pressure that forces engagement. I want you to accept that your absence had consequences, and those consequences include permanent distance. And if I don't? I pulled the last document from my bag, placed it next to the itemized account. Then I file this. Formal complaint to the State Bar about your lawyer's communications, which contained several implied threats that border on harassment. Copy to the Chamber of Commerce explaining the source of recent concerns about my business, and formal notice to every vendor in my network that any contract modifications requested due to family pressure will result in immediate termination and public disclosure of the reason. His hands had gone still, papers forgotten. You'd destroy my reputation. I'd protect my boundaries. The effect on your reputation is incidental. Over what? Over missing a wedding? Over being cautious about bad investments? Over pretending those decisions were anything other than what they were. Calculated choices to distance yourself from potential failure and capitalize on proven success. Over trying to leverage family obligation to access value you didn't create. Over refusing to accept that some relationships can't be repaired through persistence and performance. The waiter approached, retreated when he saw our expressions. Smart man, good instincts about when service would be interruption rather than assistance. I made mistakes, Arthur said quietly. I've admitted that. I've apologized. What more do you want? I want you to leave me alone. We're family. We're related. That's not the same thing. He gathered the papers I'd spread across the table, stacked them with shaking hands, pushed them back toward me like returning evidence he didn't want to possess. His face had gone from flushed to pale, the particular pallor that came from realizing you'd miscalculated badly. You've become hard, he said. I've become boundaried. You just never had to deal with boundaries before because I never enforced any. Your mother would be disappointed. The invocation of my mother, who'd passed 7 years ago before any of this started, was desperate and transparent. I didn't take the bait. My mother would understand that some relationships can't survive one person's absence during crucial moments. She'd probably also understand that trying to leverage her memory in this argument is manipulative rather than meaningful. He stood again, this time with finality. No dramatic exit, no parting shots, just exhaustion visible in the slope of his shoulders. He looked older than his 60 years, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a parent or authority figure, but as someone who'd made choices and was now confronting consequences he hadn't anticipated. "I'll stop," he said. "The calls to vendors, the questions to the chamber, I'll stop. And the contact? That too. I'll need it in writing." He nodded slowly, acknowledging the requirement without arguing. "You'll have it by tomorrow. Make sure it's notarized." He left without another word, weaving through tables and disappearing into afternoon sunlight that looked harsh and unforgiving through the restaurant windows. I sat alone at the table for 5, surrounded by papers and untouched drinks, feeling nothing in particular beyond the calm recognition that some confrontations ended. Not with resolution, but with acknowledgement that no resolution was possible. My phone buzzed. "Claire. Status?" "Complete," I typed back. "Good complete or bad complete? Functional complete. I'll take it." I gathered the documents, organized them back into systematic order, paid the check that Arthur had forgotten about in his exit. Outside, the November air had that bite that meant winter was arriving ahead of schedule, the kind of cold that made you walk faster without deciding to. The car was where I'd left it, unremarkable and exactly where it should be. I sat in the driver's seat, papers in the messenger bag, watching people move through their ordinary afternoons with their ordinary problems that probably didn't include itemized accounts of parental failure. The leather folder was at home, filed in the desk drawer, no longer needed but preserved for reference. The no-contact order was still in effect, now with verbal commitment to honor it. The boundaries were established, documented, acknowledged. Some revenge was loud, some was paperwork. I preferred paperwork. It left better records. I drove back to the office thinking about enforcement and consequence, about the difference between punishment and protection, about what it meant to value boundaries enough to defend them regardless of social cost. The phone buzzed again. Jennifer this time. "Dinner tonight? Just us?" "Perfect," I sent back. Normal felt earned now. Not gifted, not assumed, but constructed through deliberate choices about who got access and who didn't, about which relationships were worth maintaining and which were worth ending cleanly. I'd ended one cleanly. The rest was just documentation. The notarized agreement arrived on schedule, delivered by the same courier service Arthur's lawyer had used before. Claire brought it to my desk without comment, though her expression suggested she had plenty she could say if I asked. I didn't ask. I filed it with the other documents and moved on. 3 weeks passed in relative quiet. Then Arthur showed up at the Hartford opening. I saw him from across the lobby, standing near the refreshment table like he'd been invited, like his presence was expected rather than violating the agreement he'd signed. He was talking to one of our investors with the easy confidence of someone who'd decided consequences were negotiable. Claire noticed my expression, followed my gaze, swore quietly. "Want me to handle it?" "No, I'll manage." I crossed the lobby with deliberate calm, arriving just as Arthur was explaining something about family legacy and supporting my son's vision from the beginning. The investor, Michael Chen, who'd put in $2 million during our second round, looked politely interested in the way people do when they're not quite sure who they're talking to. "Arthur," I said, voice level. "Didn't expect to see you here." His smile was practiced, performative. "Wouldn't miss it. Proud father and all that." "Michael, this is Arthur Sterling, my father, who has no involvement with the company and wasn't on the invitation list." Michael's expression shifted, polite interest becoming cautious awareness. He excused himself quickly, disappearing into the crowd with practiced efficiency. Arthur's smile had frozen slightly. "That was rude," he said quietly. "That was accurate. You're not involved. He deserved to know that. It said I wouldn't contact you directly. This is a public event. That required an invitation you didn't receive. Oh, that's called trespassing, not attendance." I signaled to Marcus, our head of security. He approached with professional neutrality, and within minutes Arthur was escorted out, his dignity intact but his presence eliminated. The escalation came 2 days later through my Uncle Robert, voice careful and neutral. "Pierce, we need to talk about your father. He's not well. This situation is affecting him badly. His well-being isn't my responsibility. You had him escorted out, in front of your investors. He showed up uninvited. The escort was professional courtesy compared to calling the police." Robert hung up without saying goodbye. The third incident happened at the private club where I sometimes met investors. Arthur appeared at my table during lunch, slightly disheveled, tie crooked. "Pierce, good to see you." My lunch companion, Catherine Morrison from Philadelphia, looked between us with sharp awareness. 5 minutes, Arthur said. That's all I'm asking. We had an agreement. You violated it. Marcus? The security guard appeared, and Arthur was escorted out again. Catherine watched the exchange with professional neutrality. Then we returned to discussing market demographics like the interruption had been weather. Unavoidable, but ultimately irrelevant. That afternoon I called our lawyer. I need documentation of the violations, dates, locations, witnesses. For what purpose? Escalation. He's not respecting the no-contact order. The cease and desist arrived on Thursday. The response came that evening through Claire. Someone filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. Anonymous, but the details suggest your father. I drafted an email that night to the 15 people who'd witnessed the original dinner confrontation. Brief, factual, permanent, clarifying that Arthur and I had no business association, attaching documentation of violations and the BBB complaint, not as evidence for action, but as context. Jennifer read it over my shoulder. That's nuclear. That's factual. I hit send before I could reconsider. The real response came 2 days later from Margaret, Arthur's sister. "Pierce, I read your email. Arthur called me last night, very upset, but also honest, maybe for the first time." She paused. "He also told me something I didn't know, about a business opportunity you had 6 years ago, a partnership offer from someone in Boston. I remembered it vaguely. Good terms, solid backing. It had fallen through for reasons I'd never fully understood." "What about it?" "Arthur called them, told them you were financially unstable, that the project was too risky. The partnership collapsed. The revelation reframed 6 years of history. He sabotaged it. He says he was protecting you. He was ensuring I'd fail." The call from Marcus came 3 days later. Arthur had tried to enter the Boston property during final walkthrough, claiming he had an appointment. Security had turned him away, but he'd made a scene in the lobby. "He's parked across the street," Marcus said. "Been sitting there for an hour. Give me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive took 30 minutes, long enough to think through what needed to be said. Arthur's car was exactly where Marcus indicated. I pulled up behind him, tapped on his window. He startled, then rolled it down. "Pierce, I was hoping to talk. Get out of the car." He hesitated, reading something in my expression. He stepped onto the sidewalk carefully, and we stood there on a public street, afternoon traffic moving past. "You tried to enter my property," I said. "I wanted to see it, to understand what you'd built." Margaret told me about Boston, the developer you called 6 years ago, the partnership you sabotaged. His face went carefully blank. "I was protecting you. You were ensuring failure. You couldn't handle me succeeding without your approval, so you tried to prevent success entirely." "I made a mistake. How many times do I need to apologize?" "You don't need to apologize. You need to leave me alone. I signed your agreement. I've honored it. You've violated it 9 times. I have documentation." His jaw tightened. "I'm your father. I have a right to see what you've accomplished." "You have no rights here. You gave up access when you chose absence over support." I pulled out my phone, opened the file I'd prepared. "Every property in our portfolio now has your photograph and explicit instructions. You're banned from entry. Every private club I belong to has been notified. That's excessive. That's enforcement. You ignored legal agreements, so now there are practical barriers." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. We were still in public, still visible, still constrained by social contract. "This is cruel," he said quietly. "This is consequence. You spent 6 years trying to control outcomes you had no authority over." "What happens now?" "Nothing. That's the point. You go back to your life, I continue mine, and we don't interact. Ever." "What if I refuse?" "Then consequences escalate. Restraining order, harassment charges, very public legal proceedings." His expression shifted. Calculation visible, weighing options. "You've thought this through." "Completely." "When did you become so ruthless?" "When ruthless became necessary to protect boundaries you refused to acknowledge." We stood there, separated by 6 feet of concrete and 6 years of accumulated resentment. "I wanted to be part of your success," he said finally. "Is that so terrible?" "Yes, because you wanted the part that felt good without the part that was hard. You wanted credit without investment." "This is the last conversation we're having," I said. "After this, If you try to contact me or access any property I control, I take legal action immediately. No warnings, no second chances. Family is supposed to show up when it matters. You didn't. The calculation was visible in his eyes. One more attempt, one more angle. But something in my expression made it clear no argument would work. I see, he said quietly. Do you? I see that you're serious, that this isn't negotiable. Finally, he turned toward his car, stopped, looked back. For what it's worth, I am proud of what you've built. That's not worth anything. Pride without support is just observation. He got in his car, pulled away from the curb, merged into traffic, disappeared. No dramatic exit, just departure that looked like any other car leaving any other parking space. Marcus appeared at my elbow. That looked intense. That was closure. I went into the property, took the elevator to the roof level. Everything looked exactly as I'd planned. Claire found me 20 minutes later. Status? She asked. Resolved. Permanently? As permanent as enforcement can make it. The Boston opening happened without incident 2 weeks later. No unexpected guests, no attempts at contact. Everything proceeded exactly as planned. 3 months later, Margaret sent a brief message. Arthur moved to Florida. Retirement community. Wanted you to know. I read it twice, filed it mentally, didn't respond. The business continued expanding. New properties, new markets, steady growth that came from good decisions repeated consistently. Jennifer asked once more, 6 months after the confrontation, any regrets? I thought about the empty chair at the wedding, about the sabotaged Boston deal, about every violation of the agreement he'd signed. I thought about the confrontation on the sidewalk, about the enforcement that followed, about the silence that had replaced his persistent attempts at access. No, I said. No regrets. And I meant it. The folder stayed in my desk drawer, documentation preserved but no longer needed. Some revenge was loud, explosive, dramatic. Some was boundary enforcement that looked like nothing at all from outside, just distance where connection used to exist. I'd chosen enforcement, clean, documented, permanent, and I walked away.